The state legislature has approved the criminal sentencing reform measure known as the Three Strikes Bill. It's also known as Melissa's Bill for the woman who was killed by a repeat offender in 1999. The bill would reduce the exposure to longer sentences for certain nonviolent crimes, but opponents feel the measure goes too far and that it will add to new expenses for the taxpayers. One of them is with us tonight. We'd like to welcome the Executive Director of the Center for Church and Prison, Reverend George Walters-Sleyon. Thank you very much for being with us, Reverend.
Thank you, Grace.
Reverend, since you were talking about this bill before, there have been some changes maybe in which violent crimes would lead to an automatic loss of parole, and there have been maybe some other changes here as well. But how much better or worse is this bill right now, would you say?
Well, from the beginning, the crimes have reduced from 66, 68 to about 41 with 19 felonies attached to that. However, what we have seen, regardless of the fact that there has been, quote unquote, this revision, what we are very, very critical about is that this bill, in its passage in the Senate and the House, does not advance any adequate claim for rehabilitation and restoration, you see. And what it has basically done, some of the provisions that are very troubling. One, it has advanced the whole idea of taking discretionary permission, okay, discretionary potential from the judges, so that judges will no longer have that discretion to deal with each case on its own merit. We feel that is a huge, huge step to take, okay? And not only that, there is the other problem wherein a person who has the third strike, the third violent strike, what happens is that this person will be locked in jail forever and ever and ever, absolutely eliminating the possibility for parole. Now, these are problematic, unlike California. Okay, California has 25 years parole eligibility for the third strike, the most violent, the third strike. And not only that, but California's three strikes law maintains that judges must have this discretionary ability to deal with each case on its own merit. Okay, so that, because in that particular case, what you're doing is you're taking a case and you take into consideration the various mitigating factors, okay, that surround the particular case, rather than simply advancing a blanketed sentencing procedure for each case.
Well, of course, the bill is a response to the stories out there, and there are some that I guess they're proven to be true, that there are some people who either are repeatedly violent, or they could be violent once, they go to prison for a long time, and they come out, like the man who killed somebody in Jamaica Plain at a convenience store, comes out, does the same thing all over again. So there are people like that. So what do you do about them?
Well, we do believe that people who commit egregious crimes against other human beings must be punished. Okay, so when we advocate against this particular bill, we are not saying that there should be an allowance, a crime should be tolerated. However, what we are saying is that be smart on crime. Now, we do sympathize with Melissa, the family.
Melissa is also the victim who was killed in 1999.
Yeah, we do sympathize with that particular family. It's just about the same stimulus that gave rise to the Three Strikes Bill in California, when two horrendous murders took place. And so people just came out and said, let us put some restrictions in place and let us be very punitive. However, over the years in California, they've come to realize that being very punitive and not being smart on crime has systematically, over the years, affected the budget of California. So now California spends more money on its Department of Correction than on its schools. And so what we're saying in Massachusetts, being the intellectual capital of the world, Massachusetts ought to be very smart on crime. In that way, Massachusetts can begin to look at alternative ways, like what the Pew Charitable Trust has advanced, arguments and models. Okay, several states all over the country are beginning to shy away from three-strike sentencing and its long-term economic social implications. So we are saying, why would Massachusetts, being quote-unquote the intellectual capital of the world, begin to go towards three strikes in light of the evidence? You see, that three strikes does not reduce crime. Three strikes is not an incentive to reduce crime at all.
What about the provision about judges not having discretion on these cases? You mentioned this is the opposite of what has been happening in California lately, but there are also reports about judges who are in a certain way repeat offenders. There was one judge in Massachusetts notorious for letting drunk drivers off the hook.
Well, you see, you may have individual cases. You may have individual cases, but what we're talking about is the principle. Okay, the principle that you take away the discretionary ability from judges become problematic, because what happens in that particular context is that you give prosecutors the right, and then prosecutors then can begin to coerce a defendant into being guilty. And what happens basically is over the years, you have a lot of people being snared that, okay, if you don't plead guilty, then we'll give you a harsher punishment. You see, and so prosecutors have now more unfettered leverage. You see, that's what happens. So no longer are the judges having that leverage to deal with each case on its own merit. What you now have is prosecutors having more power.
Talk about the effect of this when somebody is counted as a three-striker, they get parole denied, but a lot of them, I imagine, they have sentences that have limits, so even without parole, I guess they would still be coming out at some time, right?
Yes, I mean, there is the provision that says in this new one that says 2/3 of the time you come out, okay, not for the most violent. But so there are provisions. However, there is also the emphasis on the mandatory minimums with respect to drug offenses. This particular bill does not touch. If it does, it just tinkers with it, so to speak, in a very small way, in a minute way. But the mandatory minimums with respect to drug offenses are still in place. You see, so what we're saying is that the three strikes may also come about with nonviolent crimes. You see, and this is the problem with that California has also encountered and observed, that a lot of the people behind bars with respect to the third strikes are nonviolent offenders, you see, as a result of drug offenses. So you take into consideration the war on drugs, all of that implies that whatever is passed, you see, whatever is passed now, if we hope the governor does not sign it, whatever is passed now becomes a problem because nonviolent drug offenders are going to be highly affected.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Reverend George Walters-Sleyon. Up ahead, the arts segment with Chris Harding.